Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. I came across Stephen and his film Life with Ghosts as part of a newsletter that a friend had forwarded me. I was so intrigued by the story behind the film, obviously because of my connection to my passion about how to deal with grief and trauma, that I decided to watch the film and listen to a panel discussion between some key players in and around the documentary. Some of you listening to this episode might have already seen the film, but if you haven't, you can go and watch it on the link provided in the show notes by offering your support in the form of a donation. Life with Ghosts has not yet officially been released because it's still in the film festival circuit. It's been selected to broadcast on PBS, and for that to happen they need to make a 56-minute version, which is why they have been raising money via private screenings. There is also a free short film version containing the basic information about the film's feature therapy, Induced After-Death Communication. The film company believes it's important to make this information available to everyone, regardless of their financial status. About this week's guest. Stephen Berkley is a writer, director and producer. Stephen has worked in multiple capacities inside the entertainment and media industry for over 30 years. He's done everything from personal promotional copy at the burgeoning MTV Channel to drafting talent agreements for television legend Aaron Spelling. His most recent endeavour is the production of a documentary film entitled Life with Ghosts, written and directed by Christopher Seward of Fahrenheit 9/11 fame. The idea for a ghost story came unexpectedly with the death of Stephen's father, when shortly afterwards his mother began reporting interactions with whom she believed to be his father's ghost, a real-life Mrs Muir situation. The film won multiple awards in the film festival circuit, including Best Documentary. The final product is a 7-year investigation into the nature of true love and science behind after-death communication. So welcome, Stephen. It's so nice to have you here and for you to spend time with us on the How to Deal with Grief and Trauma podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
How are you today?
I'm good. I'm excited to talk.
I'm looking forward to hear a little bit more. I mean, I've seen the film, but for the listeners here, why don't you take us a little bit on a journey of how grief, trauma, loss has touched your life so that we are now here where that film has been produced.
Great. Well, thank you. I love to talk about this topic. I've lost four people in the last 10 years who are very close to me. So I'm no stranger to grief and loss. But for this particular film, it has kind of a cute story behind it. So I'll just share that with you. When my father died, which was the first of the 4 people I lost in the last 10 years, my mother completely fell apart. We were all, shaken by the loss, but my dad was not a young man, so it wasn't like it was completely unexpected. But I found out just through my experience, and I never really thought of this, you assume when people get older that like a couple gets older, they would just expect each other, they would lose each other at some point, and it wouldn't be so traumatic. But when you're with someone, when you're married to someone for decades and you're their partner, at least in my situation, when they're lost, even if it's not sudden, even if they're on dialysis for years, that wasn't my father's situation, but even I found out through just interviewing people, even if the loss was somewhat expected, every loss seems unexpected. Mm-hmm. Every loss, when it happens, you didn't expect it to happen at that moment.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden the person's gone. And that alone is traumatizing. And my mother really fell apart, as I said. And my brothers and I all flew down to Florida where my parents had lived together. And we were doing everything we thought we were supposed to do to help a grieving person. No, we were all in our own grief, but it wasn't to the extent of my mother's grief. And so we all had that was the target patient. So we all congregated in Florida to help my mother, and we got her into grief support. We got her into religious services. We got her her own counselor. And all these were the conventional ways of dealing with it, but none had any impact at all. Very fortunately, my mother had a neighbor and friend named Ethel, cute little old lady who was very sweet. She came over to the house and said, Irene, I know you're having a tough time, and we don't talk about this a whole lot, but I do something to help me with my own grief regarding my own husband. And I'm going to suggest that you try it too. I write to my husband every day at the same time. I write him a letter. I tell him all about what I'm doing. I ask about him. That makes me feel really, really close to him. And then she leaned in real close to my mother and said, and he writes back. So my mother didn't know what to make of this. It was like, he writes back. What do you mean he writes back? Now, this was a relatively new loss, and my brothers and we were all together with my mother, and we were receiving this cute little old lady, but we were all a little bit, I don't know, we didn't know what to make of her. Uh, my mother was actually a little bit put out because she felt, hey, this is a new loss. This is a crazy offer that you're making to me. I don't want to think about this right now. Right now, I'm still getting used to the fact that my husband is gone.
Mhm.
My brothers were actually a little bit annoyed as who's this kooky lady accosting our mother? We're trying to like comfort her and this crazy lady's coming by. I couldn't help it. I was a little bit curious about Ethel. I thought she was just really, I didn't know anything about it. Apparently she was schizophrenic, but I was interested in her and what she was doing. And I ended up following over to her house where she proceeded to show me a stack of yellow legal pads. And on those yellow legal pads were conversations she had with her husband over a 12-year period via automatic writing. I didn't know anything about automatic writing. Again, I assumed that Ethel was crazy. But the more I talked to her and the more information I got from her, I realized, wait a minute, she's not only not crazy, she's actually one of the most grounded, sensible, smart ladies I've ever spoken to. And I just wanted to understand, like, um, how, how did you know about this automatic writing? How did it come about? Anyway, she told me her story, but making my story a little bit shorter, um, I decided very quickly after I met Ethel that I wanted to record what she was doing. I wasn't sure if I was going to make a film or not, but I wanted to record it because I'm a natural documentarian. I record everything. And I
Mhm.
found her interesting. And even though I had my own stuff to deal with because I was in Florida to bury my father, not to,
Make a documentary.
right. But I ended up flying down there on a separate occasion and introducing Ethel. Ethel already knew my mother, but my mother wasn't inclined to think about Ethel as any kind of mentor. But my mother was having such a tough time that I wanted to convince my mother that what Ethel was doing was worth trying because it was working for Ethel so well. Ethel
Mhm.
was cheerful. She was just a happy person. And I believed her. I believed that automatic writing was helping her remain happy. And I ended up vetting Ethel for quite a few months before I actually started filming, just because I wanted to I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be making a film about somebody who was crazy or who was not a good film subject, but
Mhm.
she ended up being a really good subject. And I will tell you more about how the film proceeded from there, but I want to at least give you a chance to weigh in on anything I said so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to hear the beginning of, I mean, having watched the film and didn't know as much detail as to Ethel and your mother and so forth. So it's nice to sort of look from behind the scenes into, so what started all that? So, so you mentioned Ethel had this conversation for over 12 years. So the interesting thing for me, the curiosity is where, like, how did she come to automatic writing? Because I know about automatic writing from before watching the film, but how did she come across that? Was she already doing this before her husband died, or how did she come to that?
Great question. I love to get that question because I have the answer, and it's not an answer I normally give in public because people don't ask me that question that often. Um, what happened was Ethel was a dancer. Even though she was in her 80s, she was a dancer and she was a good dancer. And there was a troupe in Florida called the Fabulous Florida Follies, which is all women between 60 and 90.
Wow.
And they're people, most of them are semi-professional, or they were semi-professional or professional in their careers, and they still want to dance. So Ethel was a great dancer who put on shows, and she hurt her knee because she reached for something in a cabinet. She fell off a chair. She ended up hurting her knee, and she was benched from dancing. So she just decided to go to the library while she couldn't dance and just read books. And she was strangely drawn to the spiritual section of the library. And she felt like the way she tells the story is it's almost like books were coming out of the shelves. The one she was supposed to pick, where it was made very obvious to her. And the first book she read was a book by Ruth Montgomery called In Search of the Truth. Ruth Montgomery was a Washington Times reporter who practiced automatic writing. And Ethel, as a lark, decided that maybe she should try it. And the very first time she tried it, she felt energy coming through her arm and moving her pencil around. She was so frightened by this, she threw the pencil down and went to bed. That's how she tells the story.
Yeah.
She did not like what was happening. Now, I don't expect people in general to say, "Hey, I'll try it too," and they'll feel the energy in the arm. I think Ethel is more the exception than the rule when it comes to automatic writing. I don't think most people feel energy in their arms, but she felt that, and she could not read her. She ended up trying it again the next day. She just wrote, by the advice of Ruth Montgomery, the author, she wrote, "Harold, are you here?" And just waited. And she tried this a few nights in a row. And and when she did start to write and she felt that her hand was moving, she was getting thoughts in her head at the same time her hand was moving. And she felt like she was actually getting something, and she was getting chicken scratch. She couldn't really read it. But she realized after really studying what she had written, the word that was written was the name of the church she was married in. And she goes, "You know what? That's Harold. That's my husband. That's him. He's coming through." So she practiced and practiced, and eventually she got to a point where she could write fluidly and she could read her writing. She would always have to go back and like dot the I's and cross the T's, but she was able to read her own writing well enough to do that. And she was starting to have real conversations with her late husband.
So to sort of tie it back to your own story, so this was in the months or years after your father died. So how did that work parallel to your own grieving process and obviously your mother's grieving process? How early, you said you vetted Ethel for quite a few months and then you started recording.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about the two timelines.
I'm not sure if this answers your question directly because I got a little confused about the timelines. But what happened was my family's focus was really on my mother, so I could talk about my own grieving process, but I feel like my own grieving process regarding all four people I'd mentioned that I lost in the last 10 years, I would say my own grieving process was, I'm trying to think of a good word for this. Not, I would say it was somewhat altered or mollified is the best word I could think of. My own grieving process was mollified because I was involved in this film, because I was starting to learn about techniques and I was starting to find people who were actually having interactions with who they believed to be the energy of their late spouse or child or husband or parent. I was in this new world where people were having these interactions and they were not sad. They missed their beloved, but they were not sad people. And I felt like I was becoming one of them. So in a way, my grieving process, I was looking for a good word for short-circuited. In a way, it was short-circuited in a good way because I was not feeling like they were gone forever. I was feeling like they were not annihilated. They just moved. They moved to the next room.
I liked what you said there about they were just moved to the other room. There's some knowing in me that I don't know whether I gathered it through personal experience or through people, what they said, probably a combination of things. But I remember clearly after my mother died of suicide when my daughter was 4.5 months old. We were sitting on the bed and my daughter at that time, an infant, was looking to the side towards the cupboard. And I had a feeling of presence of my mother, my daughter's twin, my mother's sister, and my sister, who she didn't carry out, but she had a miscarriage. I just had this, I don't know if I want to call this feeling or this wish. I don't know. But actually I had the benefit of having a friend who was a medium. And I asked her, I wanted to clarify that sense that I had. And I said, I get a sense that my daughter can see them. And I get a sense that I can feel them. How much truth is in that? So I asked her and she said, you're absolutely right. Your daughter can see them. You can't. And I asked curiously, why can't I see them? And she said, you would be overwhelmed. And I had to say yes. I would be completely overwhelmed by sight. So it makes sense. It makes sense to me. So when you said that they were just in the other room, to me it's like another memory comes back to when I worked once with a medium who did grief counseling from a medial perspective, and he explained the death of his father who went by exit. And he explained how his father connected back to him just after he left, about 10 minutes. He said, I'm here. There's no distance between here and there. It's just another presence in not even the next room, but through a veil in the same place.
There's one medium I'm working with that likes to describe that distance you're referring to as flat foot to tippy toe. I like that expression, and that's what she came up with. But I should share with you that the real crux of the film, like what really put the fire under me, because when I first started filming, it was just this cute story about two little old ladies who happened to have very different experiences in grief. One was waking up with a smile on her face. One was just waiting herself to die to join my father. So having those two different perspectives, I thought was somewhat interesting. But what happened was when I was filming, I actually went with my mother to her grief counselor's session and I was filming it. It was a film crew of 10 people in this little room with my mother and her grief counselor. It was kind of funny in that way. But anyway, we're filming them and my mother started asking questions about Ethel's process, wanting to do it herself, maybe. And the grief counselor let my mother know that what Ethel was doing was kind of a form of denial. That wasn't really the healthy way out of grief. And that upset me. Here is my 80-something-year-old mother contemplating having an experience that could give her some peace. And this grief counselor is disabusing her of this as a possibility. And I thought that just wasn't fair. I also thought I didn't even do the research yet, but I had a feeling she was just wrong about the whole denial thing because I later found out that there were studies, right now I'm thinking of one by Dewey Reese, that shows that about half the population is having the experience of hearing from their deceased loved one through one of their senses. Either they're seeing them, they're hearing them, they're feeling them, they're smelling them. But if half the population is having the feeling that they're getting a visit from their beloved from the other side, and they're actually doing better after having that experience. Some will say that nothing has helped them quite as much as getting a visit from the other side. Why would this grief counselor say, no, you shouldn't do it that way? So that kind of snowballed into something that became what the film is, where it's kind of we're exploring both sides of it. There's some people who are debunkers. They don't believe in any kind of after-death communication, and there are others that say, "Oh, sure, it's happening." And so I'm interviewing both sides, and I'm letting the audience decide for themselves. I think most people, when they see the film, they could see kind of where, by the end, you kind of know where I stand. But I try to at least show a balanced approach, so at least people don't suspect that I came into this with any kind of agenda. The last thing I wanted to do was put out a propaganda piece. I wanted just to show both sides of it and have people just see what other people are going through and how they're discovering like different methods of communication.
I liked that about the film because it wasn't preconceivable from the beginning where this is going. So it was just how I describe it. I remember I was to some degree a bit confused about the film at the beginning, but it was a good confusion because it allowed me to, I mean, obviously I had a side as well. And when this was the scene that was in the film, right, with the counselor.
Yes.
Yeah, obviously in my profession, I cringed a bit and I thought, oh. But yes, there are people who feel that is not helpful or find that denial as a form of denial. But I personally have a different opinion as to what is helpful for the client is what they feel is helpful. Could be anything. So tell us a little bit more about how then you came to the part where you found actually this system or this kind of therapy, the after-death communication, that actually was so helpful to Ethel, which probably she found on her own, right? Tell us how this piece came in.
I asked Ethel if I was interviewing widows pretty much. I would try to get a widower, but unfortunately that didn't work out. And the women were outliving the men to such a large degree that it's at least in my mother's community, there were no widowers to be found. So I was interviewing widows, and I asked Ethel during her interview, I said, do you know anybody else that might want to be interviewed about this topic? And she said, well, my daughter-in-law, you could interview her. She lost her husband, my son, a number of years ago, and she might be interested. Now, when I found out that her daughter-in-law had kids and and she said, Mike, you could interview my kids too, I was not that interested because I wanted this to be a love story. I didn't want it to be a family story. I thought, let me just focus on these couples who are looking for each other. But it turned out that I went and interviewed her kids, and her kids the whole family lives fairly close to me, coincidentally. So I was able to actually visit them and spend some time with them. And I just thought, this family is really interesting. And the mom is grieving. At that time, she had been grieving for 12 years. You can't mention her late husband's name without her bursting into tears. And I thought, I didn't know if I wanted to go this direction, but I was compelled to stay with her. And when I found out that the relationship between her and her mother-in-law, who I just interviewed, Ethel, the automatic writer, I just interviewed the automatic writer, and her daughter-in-law and her, there was an estrangement there. And, unfortunately, that's drama. Now, I'm making a film about grief. I'm not necessarily getting into the minutia of their relationships and between these two women. But it was interesting that they were not on speaking terms because of the automatic writing. That caused a rift in the family. I said, okay, there's another angle here we could explore, that different belief systems in families can be kind of disruptive. And I thought that would be also interesting to cover also. So it turns out that Karen and her daughters, that's Ethel's daughter, estranged daughter-in-law, turned out to be the protagonists in the film. They turned out to have the biggest part, and that worked out well.
Especially because that's what I said before. It makes it so real because she, the mother, is is not really warm about how does she want to get over grief, or how does not, I don't want to use get over because this is the wrong terminology, but how does she want to integrate grief? She couldn't see a way that this would go any better than what she was doing. I mean, she was very functional with her two children. She was a single parent at that point, or at least of what we could see, and she was making the best of what she could with the resources that she had.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So how long did you accompany them through their process until the end of the film, where she then went to this person doing the therapy that is so powerful?
Well, I met the family when the mom, Karen, had been in Greek for 12 years, and then it was 5 years after that that we flew to Texas. Now, the way it came about, because you asked me this question, how do we find this therapy? I didn't even get to that part yet. Sorry about that. What happened was I was sharing information that I was learning through my research with all the families I had been filming. And one of the pieces of information that I relayed to this family, that the protagonist family, was this bit about this research going on at the University of North Texas. So it just so happens that one of the daughters read an article that I had provided, along with many other articles, and said, "I'm interested in this therapy for my mom." Now, I said to her, "I'll tell you what, I will sponsor your family. I will fly you all to Texas and undergo this therapy. Just do me this one favor. Don't tell your mom don't make this offer or don't make this suggestion to your mother until my cameras are ready, because I wanted a spontaneous, natural reaction from the mom when she's introduced to this concept of after death communication, because I knew that Karen was not the type to be all in something that was so, what are the words that what are the disparaging words that are used to describe people who go for that kind of thing? New age, maybe, nary fairy. These are the pejorative terms you hear when people are interested in after death communication. So luckily, J- Jessica is her name. Karen's daughter's Jessica said, "All right, I'm game. I'll do that. I will be your mole." And she was my inside man. So I was doing all this planning with her to make sure that we were all there filming them just going about their day. And then I had this moment where the daughter says, "Mom, you're still in grief. How about this? There's this new research I found at the University of North Texas. It's called Induced After-Death Communication Therapy. And it has like an 80% success rate. And people feel like they've been relieved from their grief, even if they've been suffering for years. People seem to be relieved from their grief after two 90-minute sessions. What do you say? Why don't we try this?" And she resisted, which is great for film, but it wasn't
Which
going
is
to give
also
me.
quite natural, right? I mean,
Yes,
you wouldn't expect just because there's a film crew to say, "Oh yes, this is really not what I want, but let's do it," which I think is the beauty of it. I can relate it to so many of the people that are desperate to want to change something, but they actually don't have the belief nothing can help me.
right, right. And this is kind of a tightrope that I was walking as a filmmaker. Here, I'm with a family who I actually started to care about because I was with them so often, and they had lost their dad, the dad in the family. And I was feeling for them. At the same time, didn't have an ending for my film. Here, I've been following around all these different people in grief, going through their days. And that's a lot of footage and a lot of time not knowing how it was going to become a film. But finally, when they said they found this therapy, I said, if this really works and people are actually feeling healed from this therapy, then I have an ending. I have a happy ending. And I was torn. I wanted my heart was completely with the family. Whatever was best for them was best. At the same time, I really wanted them to have this therapy because I wanted them to get better, and I also wanted a happy ending for my film.
I want to interject there because you mentioned the word healing, and I know some of the people listening to this might have a reaction towards how can you put healing into loss, and the way I say it, healing for me is the integration of loss into your life so that you can go about your life, you can be functional, you can enjoy, you can continue living your life. But the loss is not going to go magically away. That's a fact of your life. This is part of your history, part of your biography. And
Right.
the importance of their father in this family or their husband, this is not going to diminish. But it's the pain, the painful aspect of grief, which can be changing as part of
Right.
that. So I think a lot of people listening to this want to know, well, specifically, how does this therapy works? So I've watched the film and I could see certain things that they were doing, which reminded me of something else, but I'd like you to tell. And because
Sure.
this was obviously also for you to go and figure out
Yes.
what are they doing that is helpful.
Right. So the therapy, which is called Induced After-Death Communication Therapy, is a derivative of EMDR.
That's
And
what I
it,
thought, yeah.
and in case, is your audience already very familiar with
Yes,
EMDR? Okay.
yes, we had episodes on the MDR.
Okay. So the founder of the therapy was administering EMDR when he accidentally, just by doing a couple of tweaks to the procedure, he accidentally induced, or should I say facilitated, an after-death communication. So it was completely discovered by accident. But I would say it was explained by Graham Maxey best. So I'll just try to parrot what Graham Maxey said about how the therapy works. What happens is you're doing like EMDR involves bilateral stimulation, right? You're stimulating both hemispheres of the brain. The difference with induced after-death communication therapy is that instead of focusing on the trauma, instead of reliving the trauma, you're just recalling the saddest memory that you have. Most people, when they lose someone, they keep on going back to a particular memory. Sometimes it's the last moment they saw them. And usually it's a painful image. It's either somebody who's lying in a casket, or it's somebody who's sick in a hospital bed, or somebody, if it's an accident, it's even worse. I mean, the last image you have might be a bloody image. And so those are usually pretty painful images. And what IADC, which is induced after-death communication therapy, which IADC does is the therapist asks you to recall that image, the most painful image you have, while undergoing the bilateral stimulation, and the trauma of the memory, which is like a little ball that's in the emotional centers of the brain. By doing the bilateral stimulation, that little ball, just like with EMDR, it moves. That ball it moves from the emotional centers of the brain into the language part of the brain. And that way, it's that movement allows that memory to kind of assimilate and become part of the whole being. Now that horror, that memory is not just stuck in one little place in my brain, it's become part of me. And by it becoming part of me, then I could kind of exorcise those demons that I've had. Uh, that's kind of how the therapy works. Now, how does the actual communication come from that point? That's a little bit of a mystery, but I have my own suspicions, and I could tell you what the therapists have communicated to me. They kind of liken it to going to a movie theater and sitting behind somebody who has got a tall hat. What this procedure does, by suddenly getting rid of that noise of the trauma that's been attached to the memory for all this time, by getting rid of that, it's like asking that person to lower his or her hat so that you could watch the whole movie. It's like relocating your seat to an unobstructed view. It's like suddenly, for whatever reason, as soon as the horror or the trauma assimilates into your whole being, and you have that clear view, it's almost like your antenna gets higher in that moment. And those on the other side who you've been grieving over will avail themselves of the opportunity to say hi. And it's almost invariably I think the statistic is about 80%. 80% of the people undergoing this therapy will have the sensation, either visual, auditory, olfactory, sense, or feel sense. They will have the feeling that their loved one that they've been grieving over is in the room with them. And that, I know that word healing is a little bit kind of touchy because do you really heal from grief? Not completely. You're grieving your whole life, most likely, but the quality of the grief changes significantly. Suddenly they're not annihilated. Suddenly you realize that your loved one is still here, just in a different form.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do we miss them? Of course we miss them. Is it frustrating knowing that they're here, but you can't really FaceTime them?
Or you
Yes,
can't really
that's
hug
all.
them and touch them.
Yes, that's all very frustrating. I get annoyed at my disembodied loved ones
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like they're around me sometimes, but there's not the kind of interaction that I'd like.
Mm.
And so I still get those frustrations, but that's a lot better than feeling like they're completely gone, that I will never see them again. Those are all horrifying alternatives that I'm not willing to. I should say I don't need to go there anymore because I feel like I have more information, and I could just look forward to seeing them again.
You know, I had another podcast recording today, and I said to this guest that I love the statement that says, grief is homeless love. And it's explaining that because death is part of life. So we can't get our way around it. That's the reality. So a life starts and the death is the end of it. In the case of my daughter, it was just 3 days in between of life. And so the question is, how do we deal with the fact of the non-physicality of the loved one? And the challenge that we have is because we'd rather not have this frustration. But the truth is, it's part of our lives. The same way as we are born, on the other side is this door to the other side that is called death. And it is likely to happen that there's people around us that are dealing with the absence of their physical home for their love.
Mm-hmm, yes, very good. Hey, Natalie, can I share one really great statistic that I found during the making of this film?
Sure.
I think your audience will appreciate this. This is not a wide known statistic. So there are researchers at the University of North Texas who are still researching this area. And there's one researcher there named Jenny Streithorn. Jenny Streithorn reviewed 35 studies published on after-death communication spanning 112 years, involving 50,000 people in 24 countries. And she found that 75% of people report one or more communications from their deceased in the first year following the death. That means most people are hearing from their deceased loved ones. And you might say, well, those are just grief-induced hallucinations. That's what that must be. But hallucinations are very different from these post-mortem visits, we'll call them. Hallucinations are usually distressing in nature. And people don't, the memories of hallucinations don't stay. They fade quickly over time. But with these after-death communications that people are having and reporting, not only do they usually last a lifetime and they're savored for a lifetime, but they are healing to the people who receive them typically. More often than not, people enjoy them. They find the communication pleasant, and they feel a sense of overall well-being afterwards. That's very different from the clinical definition of hallucination. And up until very recently, hallucination was a term used by doctors, and I'm sure they still do, but in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, they had hallucination connected with this phenomena until recently. Recently, they took it out. But it's obviously clearly not a hallucination what people are experiencing when they're reporting these experiences.
So I'm thinking now of those people listening to this who say, I wish I had these connections. And my thinking is, and this is a question to you, what might those connections with the loved ones look like or feel like? Meaning, my guess is that many people have actually those interactions, but they don't count them. They have them, but they say, maybe they don't call them hallucinations, but they call them invented or whatever it is. So maybe give us some information of what you have heard in the making of the film. What kind of things see, feel, hear, sensory information that these people have that you would consider those connections?
It happens in all different forms and it happens in all different ways. There are some people who are just very good visually, and other people are very good in terms of their sense of smell. But the disembodied, I don't want to come across like an expert because I'm not an expert, but I'm just going to report to you what I've heard from the experts. That the deceased theoretically will use whatever is heightened in the person who is receiving the communication. Now, there was one woman I interviewed that could swear there was cigar smoke in her house. No one smokes a cigar in her house, but her husband used to. And now she's suddenly smelling cigar smoke. That's an after-death communication using olfactory senses, right? So she asked her husband out loud to let her know that he was in the room without using cigar smoke. Use something else because she found the cigar smoke very offensive. Yeah. And he changed it to something else. I don't know what he changed it to. Maybe he changed it to a cologne, but he changed it. And what apparently he's doing is he's manipulating things in her own brain. There actually isn't cigar smoke in the air. He's putting that in her consciousness. There's one woman in the film who you saw, Maxine, who actually saw her husband in her garage while she was backing out to leave to go to work. He just appeared. So for her, it was visual. And there are people who talk all the time about how they could feel their husband in bed next to them. They could feel him sitting on the bed, even though they're half asleep. They could feel the sensation of him sitting on the bed next to them and then sometimes hugging them. So that happens very, very frequently. And with a great regularity.
I'd like to add some that I've heard that I think can or are also things that you can consider if you're listening to this. I mean, in my case, I could smell my mother's perfume multiple times. But other things that people have mentioned are symbols that they see. It could be hummingbirds, or one lady that comes to my mind, she sees hearts wherever she goes in nature as symbols of remembering her son. So there's another woman that sees or has connected the symbol of the red bugs with the black dots.
Small round bug. Ladybugs.
Ladybugs.
There we go.
Yes, or ladybugs.
We got it.
Or even other people mention, I see double digits. And that's a symbol for me as a connection. I mean, other stories that we know are, and even that medium that I've had a course with in terms of medial grief accompaniment, he said that loved ones that I've crossed over often use electrical equipment to make themselves known.
Yes. I've heard of people getting text messages from their deceased, like full sentences. Yes, that they're using technology, our technology, and they're getting better at it, it seems. But I will tell you this is advice for your listeners. If you're seeing signs occasionally and you like getting signs, don't try to rationalize what they could be. Don't think, oh, this is just me wishing that this is happening, because in a way that's kind of closing a door in your loved one's face. What you want to do is say, what if? What if that's them? Just stay open to it. You don't necessarily have to be one of those people who just accept everything as if you're a pushover. But if you say to yourself, what if that's them? That's an opening. And then you'll get more. You'll get more signs and symbols. You'll get smells. You'll be lucky enough to get a visual. But I mean, it's definitely available to us if we warm to it.
Oh, this has been such an amazing conversation, Stephen. I hope that my audience will benefit from it. And I would love to hear any one of you listening, what you've taken from this conversation. And if these people are still listening, and if it's not, then it's not. That's fine too. So thank you so much for your time, Stephen, and good luck with your film going into reaching more audience than it already has.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And just for your listeners, just to reiterate, so the website where they can go is lifewithghosts.com. And there is a free 10-minute version there to watch. So at the very least, people should watch the 10-minute version because that'll give you a really good flavor for the technique that's featured in the film. And then if you get interested in seeing the full film, you could donate enough to watch the full film, but you don't have to. Just watch at least the first those 10 minutes that are free.
Mm-hmm. So as always, I'm going to finish with the rapid fire question. Shall we do that now?
Okay, sure.
Grieving and trauma means?
It means both pain and it means learning.
And healing means?
Getting to a place of acceptance.
And what have you learned about yourself in the light of loss and trauma?
I've learned that I could handle it.
And what would be one thing that you wish people knew about loss and trauma?
My wish for people is that they know that there are alternatives. They don't have to just sit in despair. There are really great modalities that have been proven effective to such a degree where it's not just taking a shot. It really is a scientifically validated modality. The one I'm thinking of, at least, is scientifically validated, and people should avail themselves of that if they're finding themselves having trouble getting through the day.
And the last one is one specific thing that has changed since your losses and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss.
I've changed my focus in life from being a filmmaker to being someone who gets out this message. And that is that we do continue. And that if you don't believe it, just look at the research. I mean, science is now kind of coming around and they're really starting to embrace the metaphysical findings that have been found.
Thank you so much, Stephen. As I mentioned already, all the links are in the show notes for people to get more information. Is there also a place on your website that collects some of the research that you've been talking about during the show? Is there a place there?
There's a resources tab. So if you go to lifewithghosts.com, you'll see resources, and there's a lot of information there in terms of where the information in the film came from.
Thank you so much for your time, Stephen.
Of course, Natalie. Thank you for inviting me again.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.